Welcome to Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson. Thanks for tuning in today. Our topic is something almost everyone is interested in, weight loss. And my guest is Dr. Susan Peirce Thompson, author of the book Rezoom, The Powerful Reframe to End the Crash and Burn Cycle of Food Addiction. Dr. Thompson is a brain and cognitive scientist specializing in the psychology of eating, and she's the founder of Brightline Eating Solutions, a scientifically founded weight loss solution. Tens of thousands of people have already done this program, losing more than 300,000 pounds, and Dr. Thompson has lost 60 pounds herself, going from a size 16 to a size 4. Dr. Thompson, welcome. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Lori. It's great to be with you today.
So let's talk about the problem of being overweight and obesity and the health of our nation. Why is this subject more important now than ever before?
Oh, my goodness. Well, obesity rates keep skyrocketing. We all know this. We see this in the news. But of course, now with COVID among us, obesity is an independent risk factor for serious outcomes and even death from COVID. So just in the last couple of years, the risks have become even more extreme.
So you actually have really one of the most compelling and fascinating stories of weight loss. I think that your personal story is just so relatable. I know I could certainly relate to it. You talk about when you were a child growing up in San Francisco, you were kind of chunky, and you found something that helped you lose weight, and those were illicit drugs. And at the age of 14, you got hooked on drugs and developed a really serious drug habit to the point where you apparently dropped out of high school and even resorted to prostitution. And I'm going to let you take it from there and talk about how you kicked your drug habit, but then developed another addiction, a food addiction. So can you tell us more a little bit about your personal story?
Yeah, well, boy, you sure hit the highlights there. Everything you just said is completely true. Drugs were initially about, I think, the usual explorations that some teenagers decide to do, but also I was looking to lose some weight. I was already, by the age of 11, I weighed more than I weigh now, and certainly in high school I was super concerned about my weight. And so drugs temporarily solved that problem, but they were the drugs that are quite problematic, right? Crystal meth and cocaine and ultimately crack cocaine. And you're correct, I did work as a prostitute for quite a while, and I dropped out of high school. I got clean and sober at the age of 20, and I worked the 12 steps and went to a lot of meetings, and that worked instantly. It worked really fast. From my very first meeting, I was clean and sober, but I ballooned up in my weight. I knew that would happen, and at first I didn't mind because I was expecting it, but after a while, I was obese by my mid-20s, and I was super, not happy with that. So, but what's interesting, Lori, is because I'd just so recently been hooked on drugs, I was able to notice so easily that the food was addictive for me. In the same way that methamphetamine and crack cocaine were addictive, the food was hooking me in the same way, and I could feel it in my brain. And that launched me on an academic journey to figure out what was going on in the brain with that link. Yeah, I got super curious about that. At the age of 28, I did end up losing all my excess weight. So I've been maintaining this size for about 18 years now.
Well, I just think that this is for such a message of hope. Your life, I know we're talking about weight loss, but you kicked drugs. I mean, you had you were bottomed out on drugs and, with the prostitution and everything, and you kicked that and you dropped out of high school. And then later, after you kicked your drug habit, went to community college and then transferred to UC Berkeley, had a 4.0 and graduated summa cum laude, which is amazing. I know for me, I graduated thank the Loudy, so to speak. But it's such a message of hope for people who have been addicted to drugs, and for people who dropped out of high school to get back on. And then you got your PhD. And then you overcame weight loss. So this is such a story of success. But talk about how you the whole angle of addiction. You said that you were
Yeah.
addicted to drugs, and you knew you would become addicted to food. How did you know that? And talk about the whole process of being addicted to food.
Yeah, totally. Well, I didn't know I would be addicted to food. I knew I would gain weight, right? Because as a teenager, I had the experience of my weight creeping up with nothing I could seemingly do about it. And it was really only the drugs that provided a solution that seemed to work. So I knew I would gain weight. It was just when I was eating that way, Lori, there's a particular way of eating that's marked by a loss of control. Like I was eating, even though it wasn't tasting as good anymore. I was sometimes eating as I was sitting there feeling numb, and I was eating late into the night. And I would kind of look around at the packages and the sort of the stuff of my food around me, and it looked like the drug paraphernalia. All this sort of scattered packaging and stuff. And I realized, oh my gosh, I'm using. This isn't eating, this is using. It's the same thing. And I could feel it in the brain because I had felt it with drugs.
When you talk about that, I am sure so many people, including myself, can relate to that, but not maybe to the degree, to the point where you were extreme.
Right.
But you talk about, depression, oversleeping. And this is when you were like in graduate school and doing really well in your life. You had totally kicked your drug problem. But inside, you were so depressed. You were binge eating, oversleeping, obviously gaining weight and going to therapy. But that really wasn't really working for you for the longest time. Can you kind of delve into that?
Yeah, for me, the excess eating and the weight gain definitely went along with depression and low mood and excess sleeping and just feeling really sluggish and lethargic, not having any energy for my life. And when I finally adopted the solution that I teach people now and changed my eating when I was 28 years old, all that melted away. The depression melted away and my energy skyrocketed. And it was really the eating that was keeping me down. Interestingly, though, and this is such an interesting thing, Lori, because I think some of your viewers will relate to this. Food addiction is a manageable addiction in the sense that we can still succeed in our careers. I was crushing it in graduate school, and I ate all the way through my undergrad too. And as you mentioned, 4.0s at UC Berkeley and spoke at the graduation, and all those accolades were coming, even though my weight was creeping up, and I was using food to manage the stress of the success that I was having in life, the stress of the responsibilities. I couldn't manage my life when I was using drugs. My life kind of flamed out along with, the acceleration of the drug use. But with the acceleration of the food use, I was able to succeed in life and just keep using that food as a crutch. And I know that there are a lot of very accomplished people and homemakers and family raisers and people successful in their careers and people who can achieve all kinds of things. That was sort of the bafflement that I had was, why can I be successful in so many areas of my life, but not tackle this weight problem? And it's because of addiction.
So a lot of health professionals are hesitant to say that food addiction is actually a medical condition. Can you address that?
Yes, absolutely. Well, I go into this in some detail in my new book, Rezoom, because I really want our population to understand that food addiction is physiologically addictive. And what I want to point out to people is the people who say that food addiction is controversial, none of them study addiction in the brain. All of the neuroscientists who study addiction in the brain say, oh, food addiction is super clear. You can see it on the brain scan. It's right there. You look at brain scans of people who have cocaine addiction, heroin addiction, and food addiction, and they show the same pattern of blown out dopamine receptors in an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. It's the addiction reward pathway. And it's the same exact signature of addiction that we see with food. So you will hear people like eating disorder therapists and clinicians and psychologists say that food addiction is controversial, but they just haven't gotten up to speed on the neuroscience yet. They're basing their stuff on things that they learned in school based on from the 1970s and 80s when bulimia and anorexia came on the scene. And I describe the history of it in my book, Rezoom, sort of this misunderstanding and this schism of people saying that food addiction is controversial. But from a brain perspective, it's really not controversial.
All right, we're going to take a quick break and be right back with Dr. Susan Peirce Thompson. The book is called Rezoom, The Powerful Reframe to End the Crash and Burn Cycle of Food Addiction. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Healthy Living. We're continuing our discussion with Dr. Susan Peirce Thompson, author of the book Rezoom, The Powerful Reframe to End the Crash and Burn Cycle of Food Addiction. So, Dr. Thompson, right before the break, you were talking about how food addiction is scientifically proven, but you're really not talking about being addicted to, for example, broccoli. You're talking about an addiction to certain kinds of foods. Can you talk about that?
Yes, well, it's really interesting. Food is unique. Food addiction is the hardest to kick. And just remember, that's coming from someone who's actually been addicted to crack cocaine. So I have some street cred there in saying food is the hardest. Food was harder for me to kick than crack cocaine. But you're right. We're really talking about processed foods. And I like to alert people to sugar and flour because it's really foods made out of sugar and flour, those highly refined, highly processed foods that, if you think about it, are made in the same way that heroin and cocaine are made, right? You just take the inner essence of a plant and then you refine and purify it into a fine powder. And that's where you get the drug, right? The plant by itself is not a drug, but when you take that inner essence and you refine and purify it, you turn it into a drug. Now, food also is addictive in the sense that eating is addictive. And so food, one of the reasons it's the hardest is that it's both a substance addiction and a process addiction. And we can get addicted to the process of eating. And that does mean that for some people, they can keep eating just about anything and feel like they're losing control over that. Anything, even like broccoli. So, but the addiction usually starts with the processed food consumption.
So when you talk about Brightline solutions, the Brightline it's sort of like a boundary, a very distinct boundary around certain foods to keep them out. Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting, right? Because with smoking, we're super clear. If someone's been smoking 3 packs a day and now they've been diagnosed with lung cancer and they want to get healthy and preserve their life, they need to quit smoking cigarettes. They're not going to try moderating, right? And it's the same thing with these addictive foods. Sometimes a bright line, which is a clear, unambiguous boundary that you just don't cross. For a lot of people, when addiction is in play, a bright line rule is easier to live with than trying to dabble with moderation. So the bright lines are for sugar and flour. That handles the substance addiction. And then for meals and quantities, and that handles the process addiction to eating itself. And so there's actually 4 bright lines: sugar, flour, meals, and quantities.
Can you talk about sugar and flours? Because there are so many things on the market today that we're not sure if they really are sugar and flour, like all these different quinoa flours and almond flour and what is sugar and flour? What are the ones that we should avoid or people who have a food addiction? And we're going to get into how do you know if you have a food addiction in a moment, but how, if you do have a food addiction, what sugars and flours do you need to avoid?
Yeah, it is true. With the modern ways of processing food, it can be really confusing trying to navigate the landscape. The rule of thumb is pretty much all of that is sugar and flour. So in terms of sugar, it's anything added to your food to make it sweeter. And that includes agave and stevia and all of the things. And the reason is that the taste buds on the tongue have direct connections to the addiction centers in the brain. So even stevia you want to avoid. In terms of flour, it's just all flours. So anything that's ground up, it's not the source of the plant, it's the processing that exponentially increases the surface area that the digestive enzymes are going to hit that with, and it's going to change the way that it's metabolized and impacts the brain. So it's all those flours, all the ones that you mentioned, any flour.
So the bright line regarding the way people behave when and how you eat, can you elaborate on that a little bit? You just touched on it.
Well, yeah, it's so interesting because it turns out that the way to overcome the issue of loss of control and sort of willpower depletion. I call it the willpower gap that people experience when they're eating. Look, Lori, everyone knows what they should be eating, right? People actually are really clear about this. You show them flashcards, there might be some ambiguity at the edges, but pizza, no, I shouldn't be eating that. Blueberries, yes, I should be eating those, right? And you can go through the grocery store and people are like 95% clear on what they should or shouldn't be eating. The issue is with applying it in our real lives, right? Execution over the long term, especially on Friday night when we want to have beer and pizza and wings with our friends, right? That's when our willpower is going to break down. And the reason for the bright lines for meals and quantities is that sort of structure sets up a different part of the brain to start to handle our eating.
This is fascinating information. We're going to take another break and be right back with Dr. Susan Peirce Thompson. The book is Rezoom. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Healthy Living. We're continuing our discussion with Dr. Susan Peirce Thompson. The book is called Rezoom. So in the book, Dr. Thompson, you have a quiz to help people recognize whether they actually are a food addict. Can you talk about some of the questions on the quiz?
Absolutely. And it's interesting because 1/3 of people are highly susceptible to food addiction, 1/3 are moderately, and 1/3 are not at all. And the questions have to do with things like cravings. Are you satisfied when you eat a normal amount of food, or do you often feel like you want more? Do you sometimes feel like you lose control over how much you eat, like you intended to eat just a little, but you end up eating a lot more? And how much do thoughts of what you've eaten or not eaten, whether you're on your plan or off your plan, how much do thoughts of your food and your weight take up your headspace? Those are the kinds of questions that are on that quiz.
And it's interesting that you say some people can be moderately addicted to food. And so I personally can really relate to some of these things, but not to the extent. So I know already where I am. And so, getting back to this idea of moderation, just from a personal standpoint, I know that for me, I can't eat any sugar or flour or I will not be able to stop. So some people are like, yeah, when you go to that holiday party, just eat one cookie. I can't do that. Can you address, kind of that ability of not being able to stop? And some people can.
Yeah, some people can. And this is why when we say food addiction is real, it's important right after that to say, but not everyone is equally impacted, right? Not every brain works that way with food. So yes, of course, we can point to people who can have one cookie and stop. And for them, it's easier to have one cookie because it eliminates the cravings. For people like you and me, if we have one cookie, it increases the cravings. Think about it like an itch. With an itch, if you scratch it, it makes it scratchier. It makes it itchier, right? That's what happens when we eat cookies. One cookie begets the next cookie, right? Totally.
So what you're saying is really kind of contrary to what so many of the diet experts I interview say, which is, they say, just limit your sugar intake, limit your flour intake to a little bit. And you're kind of saying some people cannot do that.
That's exactly what I'm saying. And just to say, look around. How well is that common advice working for us? Just saying, right? That's what everyone believes. And it's not working, globally speaking. The average dieter makes 4 or 5 new attempts each year. If it was working, we would have a better success rate than we've got right now. But if you look at the published results of Brightline eating, they're far and away more incredible than anything I've ever seen in the published literature. So yeah, it's contrary to what you hear from everybody.
So talk about your plan. You've talked about the success you had with the 12-step program when you were kicking your drug habit. Can you talk more about the Brightline eating program?
Absolutely. It's based on a lot of support and a lot of accountability and actually a lot of love and compassion. There isn't any judgment. I know that sticking with bright lines can be very hard at first, but what we do is we take people's hand and we guide them through really changing the way that they orient to food and rewiring their brain to support them. So within a few months, what they find is that they've got an eating setup that is a lot like brushing their teeth. They just needed to learn how to do it. And that's what we show them how to do. very gradually, step by step.
Okay, we're going to take one final break and be right back with Dr. Susan Peirce Thompson. The book is Rezoom. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Healthy Living, and we're talking with Dr. Susan Peirce Thompson, author of the book Rezoom, the powerful reframe to end the crash and burn cycle of food addiction. So, Dr. Thompson, I highly recommend this book, and also your weight loss solutions program. You yourself lost 60 pounds, went from a size 16 to a size 4, and thousands of people have lost weight on your program. How can people find out more about your book, your previous books, and you?
Well, it's super easy. Just go to brightlineeating.com, brightlineeating.com. And the quiz we were talking about earlier, where people can find out what kind of brain they have, how susceptible their brain is to food addiction, to the pull of those addictive foods, that quiz can be found on that website. It's just a simple scale from 1 to 10. And when you have that information, like I'm a 10, no surprise, right? And Lori, I'd be really curious where you are. You're somewhere in the mid-range or sort of tilting toward the slightly higher. You've just adapted some really good strategies, right? You just know not to eat that first cookie at the party, right? And so I think everyone needs to know what kind of brain they have, whether they're highly susceptible or mid-range susceptible or just not susceptible, because that will tell them if they develop a weight problem or if they have a weight problem, what kind of solution is likely to work for them. So everything's available at brightlineeating.com. And if someone does want to start the Brightline Eating program, it's just $20 a month. And you get so much for that. It used to be $1,000 for the first year to go through the Brightline Eating program. And just recently, we've lowered it dramatically. And you can go through the first year of Brightline Eating for just $200. So it's just a steal. And it's an amazing community. We'd love to see you with us.
All right. Well, we're out of time, unfortunately. My thanks once again to Dr. Susan Peirce Thompson. The book is called Rezoom, the powerful reframe to end the crash and burn cycle of food addiction. Dr. Thompson, thanks so much for being here. It was great to be with you.
Thanks, Lori. It was such a pleasure. Take care.
You too. And thanks to you for tuning in to this edition of Healthy Living. I'm Lori Johnson, and we'll see you again next time.